Miles, it's good to have you here, and I was really excited about your contribution to this study Bible. You tackled a really important and really difficult topic. But first, let's tell us about who you are, what you do, what you teach, and how you got into what you're doing right now.
Yeah, so I am associate professor of theology at Abilene Christian University, where I've been for about 4 years now. So I teach a variety of things. I teach some courses for Baptist students, but I also teach a variety of things in theology and ethics, which is my background. So I really got into this question of violence in Scripture and the ethics of violence. I've been reflecting on it probably for about 20 years, beginning back my seminary days corresponded with the days of 2001. And so I was in the middle of a class on September 11th, 2001, when everything happened. And that was really the beginning of the journey for me in thinking about what does it look like for us to be the people of God in an increasingly violent world. For a lot of people, violence is an ordinary, everyday occurrence. For me, that was kind of this cataclysmic moment of recognizing that the veneer of peace and safety is often very thin, and invites us to ask a lot of questions about what it means to be the people of God in a world in which violence is frequently the norm.
Yeah, wow. You didn't pick an easy topic.
No. Well, it was the kind of topic that I don't think I would have picked had it not just shown up and begun asking questions of me.
A lot of critics of the Bible will point out that, well, they will say that the God of the Old Testament is a violent, bloodthirsty, vindictive bully, How would you respond to that? As somebody comes to the Bible assuming that, gosh, this God is such a violent God, especially in the Old Testament?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's such a good question. So I think there's a couple of ways to tackle that. One would be, here's how I wouldn't tackle that. I wouldn't tackle it by trying to create some sort of distance between the Old and New Testaments. I don't think that option is really on the table for Christians. The way that I would try to tackle it is to ask, how is it that we encounter God? We encounter God primarily through the person and work of Jesus Christ. And how does this help us to understand the nature of God? How does this help us to make sense of passages in the Old Testament which prescribe violence, and passages in which violence is maybe not prescribed but not forbidden? How do we make sense of a world which feels very distant from ours with respect to the norms of violence, both political and interpersonal? How do we make sense of that? And so I always begin by saying that for Christians, we begin with how we encounter God in and through Jesus Christ, and let that be the lens by which we then read the Old Testament and understand what to make of these passages of violence.
How do you, this is a really tough one. I hope this is okay. How do you reconcile the God who commanded, I'll just say, the genocide of the Canaanites?
Sure.
I know it's that term might be a little loaded. How do you reconcile the book of Joshua with the Sermon on the Mount? You have Jesus saying, love your enemies, and yet earlier he commanded his people to go and slaughter their enemies.
So I think what really helped me, in particular, like reading those kinds of passages, was there's an ancient Christian interpreter, Origen. Origen wrote a series of sermons about the book of Joshua. And so when he gets to this point, the way in which Origen deals with these texts is by saying, we should approach these not as models for our emulation. We shouldn't be looking for Canaanites to go out and slaughter, but rather we should be asking, what might this mean for us spiritually? And so for him, it means very seriously that we take seriously the as Paul puts it, like the wrestling against flesh and blood, right? That our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual principalities. And so that's kind of how he deals with those texts as allegorical and their importance for us today. Again, it's the question of whether or not these things happened and how descriptively these are, like whether this is descriptively accurate, I think is a secondary question. It's there. It is part of this. These are part of the stories that have formed the people of God over time. But the question is, how do we read these well? And what significance might these have for us in light of the coming of Christ?
You mentioned in passing the kind of, I think you even used the phrase descriptive versus prescriptive. Can you expand on that? Like,
Sure.
Especially in the Old Testament.
So there's two. So there's a difference between reading a text and saying, "Yeah, David goes and kills the Amalekites," right? That this is describing an event. We get an account of the way of the battle tactics that David uses. We get an account of him drawing them out of the city and then ambushing them. And I can make, I can look at that and say, yeah, this seems pretty accurate as far as like how warfare works. But there's a difference between reading that and seeing that as commendable action for the people of God, right? There's all sorts of things in Scripture that I think are there and are descriptively true, but aren't necessarily like commendable practice for us today.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Or some people frame it as like the is and the ought, right?
Sure.
The is this happened and it happened.
Yep.
It is what it is. Doesn't mean you ought to follow this. In fact, most of the Old Testament stories are getting at what we ought not to do, right? I mean, don't be like David. Don't be like these kings.
Not every story is there for our emulation, right? There are some, and maybe Judges is a great example. There's a great commentary that Paul Hinlicky, a Lutheran theologian, has written, and part of what he identifies in the book of Judges in particular is a real nationalist zeal that gets echoed negatively in other parts of the canon and other parts of the New Testament. And so he rereads, again, kind of rereading the Old Testament in light of the New to say, yeah, that maybe this is kind of a cautionary, that we can read this as a cautionary tale, not as a go and do likewise.
What do you do with, I get this question a lot, with some of these like really excessive violent passages? You mentioned the book of Judges. At the end of Judges, you have this brutal rape of this this person's concubine, right? I think it was, and then they chop her up into little pieces and sunder. I mean, just the whole thing's just
horrific. Yeah.
Why is that there? Like, why do we have that in the Bible?
That's a great question. I mean, that story in particular, I think, functions to show. So it occurred, like that story in Genesis, like when it shows up and it's, I don't really know why it's there. I could give you an explanation. I don't really know. Well, yeah. It's like, that's a good question. I mean, I know that it performs like a narrative function between like two parts of Genesis, but as far as like, why is all the graphic detail there about this brutal rape and dismembering? I don't know.
I mean, if anything, it just, the is and the ought. If it simply happened, then that would be one reason to include it. Well, this is part of their history. I also wonder too at the fact that it's at the end of Judges and the whole flow of Judges, you have this downward spiral, and you see it with regard to violence as well. Like this, it keeps getting more and more excessive. It seems like So possibly that's one reason. Let's take a more wide angle lens. Like, how should Christians begin to think about what the whole Bible says about Christians and violence? In particular, to get to more of the controversial questions, is violence for the sake of pursuing justice? Is it an option? Is it the last option? How have you had to wrestle with this question?
This is a question that the Christians have been asking for at least the last 1800 years. So the question of whether or not violence is permissible in the pursuit of justice, and what counts as violence, or how violence should be ordered toward peace, as Augustine puts it. The way that I approach this is not by asking questions about the permissibility of certain actions, but by beginning with a question of what is the kind of character that the people of God are called to inhabit. Like, what is our character supposed to be? And so if we take, for example, the descriptions of the fruits of the Spirit, or we take in the different kinds of virtues which Paul presents as consistent with the life of Christ, or being the people of God in the world, beginning with that and then working backwards to ask, what does that mean then with respect to how we approach not only questions of violence, but how we enact peacemaking, right? What sorts of practices, what sorts of tactics, what sorts of tools are available to us that are consistent with being this kind of people, right? So we begin not with the question of what is permissible and what is impermissible, but we begin with a very different question of what does it mean to be the people of God? What kind of people has God called us to be? And then you work the question the other direction.
That's good. That's really good. One of the themes in the study Bible is that the Bible contributes not just to our private faith, but our public faith,
Right.
And I mean, the question around warfare and violence is, it's, very, very much that it's talking about how Christianity approaches, these important global issues. Evangelical Christianity has a reputation of being kind of militaristic, if I can say it like that.
Yeah.
Do you see that as clashing with or flowing with the rhythm of Scripture with regards to some of these themes?
I mean, there's certainly precedent within Scripture for a much more aggressive, militaristic understanding of what it means to be God's people. You have the Psalms, which ask God to dash the heads of babies against rocks. You have descriptions of battles and kings being led into battle and leading their people. You have descriptions of God overcoming enemies with natural disasters and with supernatural deliverances. Right. Again, I think that it matters what lessons we take from that. What are these texts trying to do for us with respect to how are these texts trying to help us to be the people of God? If we, again, to kind of go back to our earlier conversation, if we take these as norms for us to be repeated, right? Actions to be repeated, then it invites us to ask, what sorts of technologies, what sorts of tactics do we have at our disposal that maybe they didn't have, which helps us to pursue this kind of action in a different sort of way? Again, I think that's getting the question all wrong.
Yeah.
I think that evangelicals have read these passages of violence in a kind of public-private split. There are some ways in which we're called to be privately, and there are some ways which we're called to be publicly. I think that's a mistake. That the way in which we are called to be privately has all sorts of implications for the kind of people we're to be publicly. That a lot of that public-private split that I think you can trace it in not a lot of ways. I trace it in some ways to like Martin Luther and the way that he describes that relationship for Christians.
The two kingdoms.
Yeah. And a couple of texts where he on the one hand commends the Sermon on the Mount as the ideal for Christian behavior, but on the other hand says that Christians should offer themselves in acts of service to be hangmen in some cases, right? I think that public-private split is a mistake. And I think for evangelicals to recover a full reading of Scripture on the question of violence means we have to knit back together that public-private split that we want to kind of keep open.
One of the main texts that come up in this conversation is Romans 13.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes people just kind of say Romans 13 as if it's some self-evident passage that advocates for kind of maybe just war theory or the death penalty or these things.
Yeah.
How would you... I know it's a complicated passage, but how do you understand what Paul's getting at in Romans 13?
So that's a really you're right. This is a passage that gets kind of trotted out as if to say acknowledging that God has people in authority also means commending acts of violence that are undertaken in like to keep public peace. I don't know that passage is really doing that work. When Paul uses the language of the sword, I don't know that he means quite what is taken to be. Maybe he does mean that. But there's a difference between governance and violence. I mean, some people would say good governance must entail recourse to violence, but I don't know that that's necessarily true. And I think we can look at counterexamples in which governance occurs all the time, absent the use of force, right? Or absent people pulling out a gun, right? So I think that it's possible that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can affirm that yes, God has that there needs to be order within creation. There needs to be some sense of polity and governance, without also saying that governance like necessitates the use of violence as a regular feature of what it is.
So you've been working on questions around warfare and violence for a long time, way before you wrote these study notes for this for the Bible. Did you discover anything new in kind of going back through passages that maybe you're already familiar with, or looking at themes that you've thought through before? Were there any changes in your thinking, or any things that you discovered that you didn't see before?
I mean, I think it really challenged me to be a canonical thinker around this, to not resort to only quoting from the Sermon on the Mount, or only looking to the passages which readily fit kind of the description of peace that I would like. I think that's always a challenge for Christians on pretty much any moral topic, is to think canonically. Right, that there might be some dissonance between Leviticus and Hebrews, or Genesis and Romans, right? And so how do we make sense of that? And I think the way forward is not to simply write off those passages that we are uncomfortable with, but to say, how might these be offering a cohesive vision? So yeah, there were lots of passages, like having to work through some of these passages. Not so much so there were some easy passages to work through in the Old Testament, like in Genesis, right? When you have the violence of Lamech, this is obviously a judgment upon Lamech's actions and about the way in which violence is now encompassing the world and encompassing human relationships in a way that it had not before, right? This is part of how sin proliferates in the world. But there were other passages that were a lot tougher because they're either ambiguous, or there's not particularly, you can read them in multiple directions. Like you can read David's military actions as simply, this is what the king did, or you can read these as commendable actions that are to be emulated. And so the trick is, how do I make sense of this without denying that it's there? How do I build this into what this looks like? I think it gave me a deeper appreciation for contemporary careful just war thinking. There's a lot of really sloppy thinking around this question, but some of the passages were really like descriptively rich and gave me a kind of new appreciation for like just war norms.
Yeah, just war theory is interesting. There's one scholar who says history knows of no just wars. Like it's a good thing to strive towards, but it's just in reality, it never really is a fully just war.
That's right.
So, we live in a world where there's constant global conflict. And every time you turn on the news, there's something going on somewhere, and right now in Israel-Palestine, there's some really difficult things going on. How should Christians think through this really difficult situation, in particular, the Israel-Palestine situation?
So with respect to what it means for Christians to live in a violent world, I think first we always begin with the judgment against violence that we see, I think, throughout Scripture, which is to say that violence is not the norm of what creation is meant to be, right? Violence shows up first with the fall, and it proliferates in interpersonal relationships, in the relationships between tribes, the relationships between nations. It is never taken to be the ordinary norm by which people are to live. So I think we have to begin there and just to look at violence in all of its forms as not what we were meant for. So to then look at something as complex as Israel-Palestine is to say that the loss of life, whether it is through the terrorism of Hamas or it is through the killing of Palestinian civilians, like this is all the destruction of those who have been created in the image of God. If death is the final enemy to be defeated, then I find it difficult to think that Christians could celebrate the deaths of anyone through warfare. So that gets to be the real challenge then, right? It doesn't put you in the camp of it. It makes it so that I think Christians find themselves committed to a peacemaking process in which any process is going to be, no one is going to be happy with the outcome, right? It's going to require people giving up things in a variety of ways. I am not a policy wonk, and so I can offer no hard solutions on that, except to say I think what is required is something like you've been seeing. You've seen statements issued by different patriarchs and archbishops in the area who have offered themselves in exchange for those people who have been kidnapped. You have seen voices being raised from both Palestine and Israel calling for a ceasefire or calling for a return to a peacemaking process. You have seen condemnation of both indiscriminate. You've seen a condemnation of indiscriminate killing in all of its forms emerging from a lot of different corners. I think the thing that Christians have to be wary of is coding violence as good when it benefits our team and bad when it affects our team. Right.
And the team is interesting. I mean, Palestinians have a pretty rich, vibrant Christian community.
Oh,
It's in the
absolutely.
minority, but it's
Yeah.
really... and so even in Gaza, there's 1,000
Yeah.
believers, and several of them have been killed. And
Yeah,
it's like, if
absolutely.
we think team, well, those are part of our team, regardless of
that's
their
the
skin
complicating
color.
the complicating thing is when we think of violence in terms of that which is benefiting, like that is supporting our cause or supporting our side, that our side exists not just in one place but many places, right? One of the so a thinker that I live with a lot is Dorothy Day, who she's a wonderful woman that more people should be reading. But one of the things that Dorothy Day noted in the wake of the Second World War was the way in which the Second World War involved Christians killing other Christians, right? That this is the story of most conflicts, right? That when the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan, it took out one of the largest centers of Japanese Catholicism that there was.
Yeah.
Period. Like that's what happened. So you have Christians applauding the deaths of other Christians, which I think is just horrific.
Yeah.
Right. So beginning to think about this question of Israel-Palestine is to remember that in this geopolitical fight, you have the people of God killing each other. And that should not be, right? This should be an occasion for the people of God in one unified voice to say, we cannot and must not kill each other.
Sounds basic, but
That sounds very basic.
It gets
right.
complicated
But yeah.
global kingdom.
Right.
I've often heard it said that, like, violence begets violence. Like,
Yes.
Do you find that to be true theologically and just in the political arena?
Absolutely. I think a great case in point is, so let's go back to like Genesis with the banishing of Hagar and Ishmael, right? So Abraham has these two sons, both of whom God provides for. You skip a few chapters forward in Genesis, And you have the story of Jacob. And who does Jacob get sold into slavery to? The Ishmaelites, right? This story of brother against brother is one which begins as interpersonal fights, which expand into tribal conflicts, which over time take root in an imagination far beyond like the specific tribes that are in place. And now we're thinking about Israel versus the Gentiles more broadly, right? So the violence in a very intimate and small scale, it expands out, and once it gets out, it goes in innumerable ways and it takes a lot of different forms.
Well, Myles, thank you so much for your time, and thank you most of all for your contribution to the study Bible. Your notes were, you were dealing with really complicated passages and themes, and you did so in a way that was, I think, filled with academic integrity, but you also presented your ideas in a way that's very engaging and understandable. So,
yeah, it was a lot of fun to be a part of.
Really appreciated working with you.
Yeah.